the motion. All right, so on the motion that this House believes that it is never legitimate for states to comment on the domestic politics of their former colonies or territories, I invite the OG to open up the debate. Here.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, give me a moment. Let me just. Right. Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I think it is regrettable when colonizers are allowed to overstep boundaries, but I think it's far worse to the point when we view it as legitimate. So our stance for today. So we believe it is never legitimate for states to comment on the domestic politics of their former colonies or territories. Our end goal for today is that we allow these former colonies or territories to self determine and have control over their political sphere, especially after undergoing years and years of colonization. We want these colonies or territories to decide what their national aspirations are and how they want to run their government, etc. Overall, we want these colonies to maintain their sovereignty, and by allowing for other states to comment political on the political affairs of their country, we think that this disrespects this sovereignty. And so we'll be going on to our mechanism. So what exactly does this look like, right? So we think that we don't think so what do we think that is not legitimate? We don't think that these states at like international gatherings or conferences, etc., representatives and states as a whole should not be allowed to comment on the domestic politics. So this includes, but it's not limited to, the elections, policies, candidates, especially if it's about which candidate is the most suitable, stuff like that. So let's go on into the burdens of proof on both sides of the house. So in opposition, what they have to prove is that these states not only have the right to comment and overstep these boundaries and comment on the political affairs, but they also have to prove that these rights also outweigh the rights of these countries to independently control their political affairs. On our side of the house, all we have to prove is that these countries should be allowed to be independent, and by allowing states to comment on their political affairs, it does more harm than good. So I have one main substantive for the House today. I'll be discussing why principally these colonies or territories have the right to independently control their political sphere and political affairs. The thesis of this argument is premised on self-determination. So what exactly is self-determination, right? So when we look at on a more minor scale, when we look at like self-actualization, but it's the principle where at its core, essentially countries have the right to determine their political status and freely pursue their social, cultural, economic development independently, right? Especially without influence from their former colonizers, right? We think that especially when we look at countries that have been formerly colonized, it's already hard for them to be granted this sort of control after it has been taken away from them unjustly and unfairly. We think that it's now their time to be able to have this right and to fulfill the identity of their country, especially without the control of colonizers who had exploited these countries, right? We think that these former colonies and territories were deprived of forming their own identities as countries, right? Especially if we look at political upbringings that these colonizers enacted on these countries, right? When we look at how like these colonizers disrupted the government, and in fact, a lot of these um, former colonized states, right? They could have had a flourishing and prosperous, especially if we look at like political upbringings, right? They could have been prosperous and they could have been doing really well, but because of colonization, they crippled a lot of these colonies and territories and severely damaged them. And now we think that given that damage, we think that they can no longer have that sort of control over these countries, right? And we think by allowing these states to comment on their political affairs, you deprive them of their right, right? Because you grant them this undue sway and influence over their political sphere, and it makes it even harder for them to develop their identity. Why do we think that this is important in today's debate, right? When we look at how these colonies or territories have operated after they have been colonized, I think is that a lot of the time their political sphere has been not only sometimes crippled but disrupted, in the sense that these individual countries have not been able to meaningfully form their policies, meaningfully decide their political status without intervention. I think it is important while we recognize that sometimes these policies and their political affairs may not be perfect, right? Especially if we look at the fact that the whole structure and system of their political affairs within those countries have been damaged from colonization. I think that while they remain imperfect, we think that it is up to them to perfect their political system as a whole, right? We think that independence is important, irregardless of whether or not these states would be able to help them, whether or not these states would be able to provide like objective and practical like feedback or help within these comments. We think that is not meaningful if we look at the way that it weighs against um, an independent colony's right to really decide what they want to do in their political sphere, right? So when we look at these countries, and if we look at the ground, right, we think that not only does this affect these countries as a whole, but it affects the people as a whole, right? These individuals who have been the product of like colonization, these individuals who have been under the control, the authority, and perhaps even the tyranny of like former colonizers, right? We think that these individuals have undergone so much pain, so much suffering, so much misery, and the lack of freedom that was that has arisen from colonization. We think that it's regrettable that these individuals will no longer be freed of the right, where we think that these states should be allowed to comment, and we view that these comments are legitimate and is within their right and within their position to make these comments, right? We think that while we allow these countries to also develop their political sphere, you also on a more micro scale allow individuals to self-actualize their political beliefs without the kind of influence and sway that these colonizers will give, right? We think that not only will you allow these countries to decide for themselves their political status, and we think that that is important, right? We think that it is okay for them to undergo perhaps a long and grueling process of self-determination, determining what they want to do with their political sphere. But we also think that translates into how individuals are able to, for instance, choose their candidates, right? We don't want them to choose based on the kind of metrics and criteria that these states have set up for them, like, and that these states have been trying to communicate to them through these comments. We think that individuals need to decide for themselves. We think that these countries need to decide for themselves. And because we really stand for the self-determination and the formation of their own independent identities, extremely proud to stand in the government. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for that fine speech. Now to open up the opposition bench, I invite the leader of all to speak. Okay.
I'm just checking if I'm audible.
Yep, loud and clear.
Right. So POIs, please raise them in the
Am I audible?
Your mic's a bit soft for me. Can you like say another sentence?
Hi. Am I audible now?
You should be audible.
Okay. My preferred gender pronouns are she, her, and I accept POIs verbally. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Team Opposition's case came dangerously close to supporting oppression, but is never willing to explicitly say so. Just listen to their language when they say that they want to support states to comment on domestic politics of their former colonies or territories, because they recognize that suggestions are technically like strategies for them and it will actually benefit. But we don't think so, right? Because in my first speaker, we have already mentioned how like by having commenting on former colonies or territories, it only hampers their like own decision making for the country, and furthermore, it doesn't allow them to actually self-determine for their own state. What's more important is because we recognize that these former colonies are no longer under the states or like big allied powers, right? That because they are no longer under any controlled power, that's why they have the decision and they have like the capacity to actually determine and to make decisions on their own without any sort of like intervention from other states. But before that, I've one point of contention for the House today, which is which side is better able to cater towards this former colonies or territories, right? And which side is better able to benefit them at the whole. So on side opposition, this is where they state on one line that comments made publicly is when states face backlash anyway. So like technically it's okay for it's legitimate for states to comment on like domestic politics. But we tell you it's not true because basically they are saying because states are being transparent, it is acceptable. We don't think this is true, right? Because at a whole, like patriotism of citizens of the states are not going to actually call out the government for it. And furthermore, we think that in like social media, for example, where like a large majority of like citizens from a particular state actually dominates this app, and that it doesn't actually allow them, doesn't allow the government to acknowledge like the problems that they're facing. But secondly, they also said that how like the South China Sea dispute, it allows countries like allows the country like US to actually help intervene. But we think what's problematic when countries like US intervene is that because there's a really long like Cold War between the US and China, right, it's going to inflict more harm towards other Southeast Asian countries who are also facing this like dispute. Whether the US has their own political agenda should not actually involve other states under their formal rule. We recognize that because like states like countries like Philippines are no longer under the US rule, that they no longer need to conform to that, and US can't shouldn't really intervene their own politics. But furthermore, we think that global powers get that power, right, because of strategies like exploiting other countries. We recognize that in like colonial rule, the US did actually colonize like a large number of other states or countries, and because of that, we've moved on to a more civilized and democratic way, where like countries are no longer under their power, and that's why we need them to exercise and to self-determine their own decisions for themselves. So we want them to actually, so on site proposition, they wanted to develop strategy to move in the global war. I think these comments will not have significant value or change in the decision-making process of this country. That is exactly the problem. I think firstly, we need to recognize that global powers are not just global powers because of like these strategies, right? These countries have moved forward because of the exploitation of the territories and colonies. It's absurd to assume that these colonies and territories have like the same capacity to even use the same strategies. These strategies are also unlikely to apply to like the political situation of these colonies and territories because it doesn't explicitly help these former colonies or territories. It only helps the states who want to further their own political agenda. And secondly, we think that yes, these states have the agency, but if we weigh it against like the agency of these colonies and territories, it's not as important as allowing these states to develop their own identity. Like what my first speaker has already mentioned, that we think it's extremely important for states, especially like lesser developed countries, to determine their own self-identity because they're no longer under sort of any rule. They need to exercise their own agency in order to like improve their own economic system, in order to help their own citizens because it's catering to their own needs. We don't think it's necessary for states who once colonized them to intervene in their own political rule. As we already preempted, these colonies and territories are imperfect, but we need to recognize that developing as an independent country is a long and hard but meaningful process, right? We think that these powerhouse or like allied powers countries have also had their fair share of human rights issues. So like the war between the US and Vietnam, right? We think that we do agree that that there's a conflict between them, but we don't think there's a need for them to actually like control the political sphere of other countries just because they want to further their agenda. Now moving on to my substantive on how on our side on side opposition, they are only going to further perpetuate a power imbalance between states and their former colonies. So let's give the example of like big allied powers, right, such as US that like colonized Cuba once. So they've launched airstrikes on Cuba and like further sanctions. But why do we think this is problematic other than like principally? We think we need to recognize that Cuba is like no longer under the US rule. And this allowed these former colonies to self-determine and make decisions for themselves. We think the US no longer have ties with Cuba and like Cubans need to be able to exercise their free will without influence from the US. This is where my first speaker mentioned that because when states who actually do comment on like the domestic politics, right, of their former colonies, it only causes like the former colonies to not have their own fair share of like opinions, not have their own fair share of exercising their rights. I think furthermore that we think that in developing states who were once colonized, it's really difficult for them to rebuild and like sustain their economy. Especially since like after coming out of war. We think this is one example of why even if states are going to help them through like foreign aid, but we don't think that it will actually benefit them because we do agree that states do have their own political agenda and there's not a need for them to actually intervene in other former colonies or territories. We think that on-site opposition, we've allowed them to overstep. But moreover, we challenge the opposition to prevent like legitimacy, right, for them to also take action because they have not distinguished these comments to taking actions. On-site opposition, they have never once characterized what are these like comments going to look like. So whether they're going to be like intervening in through they're going to intervene through like social media, for example, or whether it's going to like be a further harm on our side. But before that, do you have any POI from opening opposition?
Right. We've told you already that because the world doesn't exist in vacuums, it's necessary for, oh, sorry, 7:15.
Because on our side, we're best able to prove that former colonies are able to self-actualize and to self-determine for their own rights. We stand on side proposition.
Thank the speaker for that fine speech. Would also encourage all speakers to also time themselves as well as the current speaker speaking. I guess I'll start posting timestamps in the chat as well to help. All right, so to close up the opening half, I invite the yellow to speak. Here.
Hey, can someone just give me a thumbs up or something to let me know that I can be heard? Thank you, Annabelle. I will take POIs in the chat. Just chuck in POI for whoever you are, whatever your team name is, and I will take you at some point. Panel, I presume we're ready to go?
Yeah, whenever you're ready.
In which case, I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The reason we have to take this round is because we're going to be the first team to actually engage with the topic and tell you what legitimacy is at the point where we've managed to get through 5 speeches in a topic about legitimacy and no one has yet told you what makes an action legitimate or what legitimacy is. The first team to do that is the only team that engages with the topic and the team that is going to win. So why do we think these actions are legitimate? The first thing to say is that most of this debate has been, are these actions harmful or not harmful? I would note that is not the definition of legitimacy. How we determine legitimacy is, ought you, in a reasonable way, in the set of tools that we allow to be used in foreign policy, be allowed to comment. That's to say that it is probably like morally harmful to shoot someone in war, but we still say that that is a legitimate tool of war when you compare it to the illegitimate tools of war, things like much more destructive weapons. What that means is that even if it is true that this can be harmful sometimes, it is also clear that it is a tool that is absolutely in line with other legitimate tools that we allow to be used in foreign policy. Things like diplomatic lobbying, things like voting in international bodies, which exert similar levels of influence. At that point, what I've just shown you is that these tools are legitimate and they are part of the set of things that we ought to consider legitimate in foreign policy. We're the first team to engage with legitimacy, and that extension on its own is sufficient for closing opposition to take this round. The next thing I'm going to explain is why it is that these post-colonial nations are owed a duty by their former colonizers, right? Because opening opposition is like, they vaguely assert that sometimes this will help, but they never tie this to legitimacy. They never explain why it is that helping makes this action legitimate. I'm going to tell you why they are morally obliged to help, and that's twofold. First of all, they are the ones who are responsible for the suffering that these colonial estates are often going through, and that means that they have that their colonizers have in fact an obligation to try and remedy the harm that they have done through things like commenting. And secondly, for the reason that they are the states with the most ties to these countries, they are the states with the most power, they are the only ones who are able to remedy that harm. That means they take on an implicit obligation to try and help them. At the point where they have an obligation to help these states, it is absolutely clear that they like it is a legitimate tool. This is to say that even if you believe that opening opposition proves that it helps, which they don't, they just vaguely assert, but even if you believe it, that is not tied to legitimacy. That does not, even if it helps, they never explain why the fact that it helps makes it legitimate until my speech, when I explain that they have an obligation to help and therefore helping makes that action legitimate. The next prong of extension here is to point out that, and this completely knocks out OJ, right? Because they're like, yeah, but we care about their sovereignty. What I'm going to point out is that in the absence of these tools, they're likely to use, like in the absence of being able to comment, they're just likely to use worse tools, which is absolutely the biggest impact in the debate. Because if counterfactually they would do worse things, obviously any harm that comes from these comments isn't significantly large, right? So we think that if they want to influence politics and they're not allowed to comment, they'll do things like, first of all, comments that don't happen on the international stage, that happen behind closed doors without the media being able to scrutinize them. They'll use things like propaganda campaigns. They'll use things like covert black ops to influence governments like the United States did in South America. And also, they're less likely to give up their colonialist influence in the first place for the reason that they can no longer influence the states once they've given up colonialism. So they're not going to be like, well, the state isn't quite ready to be independent. It's not quite developed enough, but we can guide them through. At the point where they're not allowed to guide them through, apart from once they give up colonialism, that provides a disincentive to stop being colonialist. And that's the biggest harm in this debate, right? Because you delay the ending of colonialism. The next piece of extension from closing opposition is about credibility, which is now what we're going to do is we're going to explain why this is actually helpful to these states. Noting closing government's extension here is like, sometimes this is harmful. Read the topic, guys. It's not on net are these comments harmful or not harmful. It's that it is never legitimate for states to comment. So if they are sometimes helpful, then op bench carries this debate, and pointing to cases where they can be harmful does not meaningfully constitute an argument in this debate. So the first reason they're particularly helpful is that the fundamental goal of a state in its early years when it's developing is to prove that it is a stable and legitimate player on the international stage. And each of that for three reasons. First of all, in order to get development loans, because international institutions have faith that they'll pay them back. Secondly, in order to get aid, because the international institutions or countries who give it to them then have faith they'll use it well. And thirdly, in order to get trade deals, because no one wants to hitch their wagon to a trade deal with a country that is unreliable, right? The problem is that these states are often seen as deeply unreliable because they're new. They're seen as having lots of internal turmoil. The way that these states who formerly colonized them are able to remedy this is that they can bring them credibility on the world stage by commenting on their politics, explaining in what ways they are stable enough, advocating for them to be brought into the international community and help. That's how they're able to economically develop, through trade and development loans. That removes things like egregious poverty, egregious suffering, and destitution. That's absolutely the biggest impact in this debate. I'll take a POI from OJ.
So if you say that basically that you would allow them to make these comments because it prevents them from using much worse tools, what's to stop these states from seeing the legitimacy in their comments and then moving on into taking these sorts of actions?
Like, obviously you have to be comparative here. Maybe there is a chance that they'd still make the worst option, but at the point where you make those worst options their only option, they're comparatively more likely to do it. All right, the final thing here is to explain why you're able to stop bad things from happening in these states. OO vaguely hints at this, but I'm going to do three things that they never do. First of all, I'm going to explain why these states would be able and want to do good things. That's for a couple of reasons. First of all, they have the closest ties to these nations, the most information about them. Secondly, they're the ones who often the most care, because they most care about these states for the reason they have ongoing guilt from colonialism. They also often have strong anti-colonialist lobbies, and they have strong trading and security reasons to want these states to economically develop, right? Secondly, what kinds of things are we talking about, and crucially, why they're likely to exist in post-colonialist states? The first thing to say is that these states are often weak and therefore are targets for other colonialist powers, things like China, right? So, for instance, we want former British colonies to be able to have Britain calling out Chinese neo-colonialist influence on them. Secondly, we get human rights abuses. That's for the reason that these states, the colonialist states, often drew arbitrary boundaries and put ethnic groups in together that had no business in the same state, and that led to the abuse of an ethnic minority, right? For instance, Australia's treatment of Indigenous people, or the British calling out the way that Hong Kong is abused by China. And thirdly, for the reason that these states are often very weak, given how the harms of colonialism that have happened to them, that means that they're likely to backslide into dictatorships. This is something OO never tells you, which is why explicitly is it that these states are likely to need the help as a result of colonialism. They also never tell you why these comments are likely to be particularly useful in helping these states. We give you 3 reasons. First of all, it's the only way to bring international media attention. If there is some tiny little country's leader who comes out and talks about internal political turmoil and them trying to be overthrown, no one cares. If Boris Johnson does, because it's a former British colony, that brings international media attention. Also, these states often still have cultural ties to the countries that colonialized them, for instance, through their media, so you're able to influence their domestic politics. And thirdly, you're able, because you have more influence in international bodies, you're likely to be able to mobilize those international bodies to help fix those problems.
I speak of what I find speech, not some of the.
Okay, can I be heard okay?
Yep, can.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll take POIs in the chat. Okay. Okay. What we have on side government today is an incredible amount of moral outrage at colonialism. Obviously, that is completely fair. What they fail to do, however, is to provide you with a single solution to help combat the consequences of this. That is what we give you at closing opposition. That is why we win this debate. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, why do we beat closing government? Secondly, why do we beat opening government? And thirdly, why do we come up over our opening team? Okay, firstly, I'm going to deal with closing government. And I think I can deal with their case and explain why we beat them in two main issues, but I'm going to address 5 just to be, I don't know. Because, okay, firstly, I think I have to point out that they have an incredibly unclear extension, and that is probably the clearest reason why they cannot beat us in this case. What they do is kind of repackage and adds a bit of new analysis to their opening government's case. They talk a lot about independence. They talk a lot about how these former colonializers will have political influence. They talk about how colonialism sucks. That is all things their opening government brought up. They don't expand on it sufficiently to get over them. Secondly, they say that they achieve no polarization or conflict under their side. They solve political conflict. Firstly, this is an incredibly high burden to set themselves. At the point that they fail to prove this, which they absolutely do, they lose by their own metrics. Okay, thirdly, they bring up this idea of terrorism and the Taliban and Syria, which is actually the perfect example of why international commentary can be incredibly legitimate. Like, unfortunately, no one in the West cares about what Afghani leaders say at the point that you have American presidents and US prime ministers and English prime ministers talking about the Taliban, talking about terrorism in Syria. That is when you get international attention. That is when you get better solutions to these problems. That is an example for our side. Okay. Fourthly, they say that you get more nationalism and extremism on our side, and that also on our side, it's bad for economics. Unfortunately, they don't prove these. They don't analyze it and step it through. So therefore, it's really hard for me to actually respond since there's no analysis to respond to. And fifthly, in terms of closing government, what they come up with at WIP is this definition of legitimate, that for something to be legitimate, it has to be like completely pure of heart. Firstly, what this essentially does is ban all political actions. No country ever makes any political decision completely like selfishly. There are always motivations and selfishness there. Like, that is not an argument against commentary on politics. That is an argument against any kind of political like system anywhere. And secondly, Matthew already told you that these nations do have good incentives. They have things like they want to keep security in their region for self-interest, but they have economic reasons, that they are often big trading partners with their former colonizers. And obviously they have economic interest there. And also things like guilt, that is not necessarily something that the government feels, but that influences public opinion. And for democratic governments, public opinion is incredibly important. Okay, I think that's dealt with CG pretty comprehensively. Essentially, I don't think they extend enough on their opening to win this debate. Now I'm going to deal with opening government. They have one big push, which is that we support independence and sovereignty. The commentary impinges on this. At the point I can prove to you why this fails, they have nothing left in the debate. They lose. 5 main responses to this push. Firstly, political commentary does not impinge on independence and sovereignty. For example, if a nation comments on US politics, like comments on like Joe Biden and some action he's taken, that is not impinging on US independence. That is just commenting on politics. They never prove how this influences independence and sovereignty. Secondly, what we tell you at closing opposition is that states actually have a duty to support these nations because of the impact of colonization. Matthew explained that to you very clearly. Thirdly, Matthew also tells you that the alternative to this is worse, that if you cannot openly comment on public pressure or on politics, you are not going to be quiet. What you are going to do is pressure behind the scenes, which means there is no accountability, no visibility, no media coverage. You're going to engage in things like black ops and spying. And therefore, that's incredibly more harmful on the comparative side. Colonizers are also less likely to give up nations because they do not want to lose that influence that they can gain even when they've given up colonized. Fourth response to this, that it gives these nations more international credibility, which allows them to develop economically and politically, which is something that the government bench has signified as being very important, that they want these countries to develop. This is how we get it, through giving them credibility, through strengthening their ties with other nations. They cannot function on their own. No nation can. And fifthly, former colonizers can help their colonies address modern oppressors. Like, of course, the British were the oppressors of Hong Kong, right, when they took that as a colony. I think now in the modern day, we have to accept that Britain is the good guy. China is the much bigger threat in terms of restricting democracy and stuff in Hong Kong. Britain ought to be able to speak out and try to address that on the international stage. 3 reasons why they can help. Firstly, that these states have more power, international pressure. They have leading roles in things like the UN. Secondly, they can create great media attention, as Matthew tells you. And thirdly, they can mobilize international bodies like the UN. The alternative is either isolation, which no country can handle, or a modern oppressor. After those 5 responses, I don't think OG has anything left standing. Therefore, we win. Before I get on to OO, I will take a POI from closing.
Yeah, you do realize that it is colonialism that caused the problems in the first place. And now further attention from the ex-colonists have caused nothing but further chaos, like in regions like such as the Middle East, right?
Okay, so yes, so obviously colonialism is bad, right? No one is arguing with you, but we cannot turn back the clock and fix those problems. The threat to them, to areas currently, is not European nations who are democratic nations. It is modern oppressors who are not the same as those colonial powers. You need to actually prove that there are consequences in the contemporary world. You can't just assert it at me with one example. Okay, why do we beat our opening? 2 main reasons. Firstly, we prove why these actions are legitimate. This is incredibly important because it's part of the opposition bench burden and the topic. We need to prove why this commentary is legitimate. Matthew gives you 2 main reasons. Firstly, it's in line with other diplomatic tools, things like diplomatic lobbying. Therefore, if it's in line with things that are considered legitimate in the status quo, it is legitimate. Secondly, these nations owe former colonies. I think Matthew went over that pretty well. And the second reason why we beat opening opposition is we prove why these comments are beneficial and lead to positive change. And this is really important because it outweighs the government's harms of moral outrage, and we do it at closing. So it is not a benefit that can fall to our opening team. We prove that it will help these nations gain credibility in terms of gaining loans, aid, and trade deals, which will drastically improve people's standards of living. We can bring international media attention to political problems, and that these nations are more powerful. For those reasons, vote with closing opposition. We clearly win this debate. Thank you.
Thanks, Speaker, for the fine speech, and all speakers for your wonderful speeches. This wraps up the quarterfinals of the Novice debate.